Hello again, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Kerbal Space Center in Kerbal Space Program 1.2 tutorial for absolute beginners. Today's goal is to get into orbit. Once we get into orbit, we can go anywhere in the solar system that we would like to go. But essentially, what is an orbit? To put it simply, in a very general sense, an orbit is where a vessel or a body, an object, will have enough speed around its parent to be pulled at the same rate that it's traveling. And that would be a circular orbit, like the moon, let's say. An orbit is just something that goes around another object. If you jump, you are technically in orbit, but coming down, a ballistic orbit. Our goal today is to get a stable orbit. So on Kerbin, that means we are above 70,000 meters at all times, and we are constantly being pulled in by Kerbin. Now, a perfectly circular orbit will have the same apoapse and periapse. That means the highest point of its orbit is the exact same height as the lowest point of its orbit. If that is the case, it will have the same speed around the body because the body exerts a constant pull. Even if you're out here, it is a constant pull, but it is much lower than the pull that it exerts when you're right here. The closer you are to an object, the greater the gravitational force. So if we were to cruise at 75,000 meters all the way around, we would need to be much faster to not fall into the planet than the moon. And Minmus is much slower than that because it's way the crap out here. So our goal today is to take a spacecraft and get it into orbit. Let's say an 80,000 meter orbit would be fine. And then we can plot a maneuver to head out to Minmus for the next episode of landing. So how are we going to get out there? Well, first, let's open up the vehicle assembly building. And there is a stock craft that I would like for you to load, and that is the Kerbal X. 74 parts, 8 stages. We will load it. And there are a few different things on this rocket that I would like to go over before we launch. First of all, you will notice that it has a lot more engines. Next, you will notice it has a much bigger engine. And the next thing you may notice are these clamps that is holding the rocket up. First, I'd like to talk about these yellow lines coming off of these particular engines, or these fuel tanks. If you look real closely, you can see 3 black triangles pointing to the right. What this means is fuel from this stage, these 3 fuel tanks here, is constantly pouring into this tank to keep it full. Conversely, this tank is also pouring all of its fuel to keep this tank full. And then conversely, this tank is pouring into the big monstrosity in the center to keep it full. So if you're thinking, holy crap, then this guy is doing a lot of work, you're absolutely right. This guy will run out of fuel very quickly, but the beauty of this system is all engines can be firing at once. Sure, you'll lose this stage, and then its sister, or its twin over here, you'll lose them very quickly after launch, but when you let these go, these tanks will still be full. Then these will burn out, and you will release these. These tanks will still be full. And then when these tanks finally burn out, this whole center section will still be full of fuel, and we'll have this big boy pushing us into space. The next thing you'll notice are these clamps that's keeping the spacecraft afloat. They are this action group here, number 7. So when we hit the space bar, all of these engines will ignite. At the bottom, you see them glowing green. At the second spacebar push, these clamps will release, allowing the rocket to fly. Also, you see these fins on the main tank. This will keep us pretty well straightforward. The next thing you notice is these clamps. So, as we said, this tank will run out of fuel first because it's pumping fuel to the right. So these clamps are the first to go. They're glowing green. Once they burn out and we launch them, These tanks will run out of fuel. Then we will launch them off. These clamps glow green. Lastly, these tanks will run out of fuel, and those are the last clamps that we fire, and then we'll have just the big rocket. So once this big section runs out of fuel, our next stage is right here. This is a decoupler, which will separate this entire section from the rocket, leaving us with only this part here. Now there is an engine up in this enclosed area that is using this fuel only. This fuel is not touched during the launch process because this engine is not on. The next thing you notice are landing legs, which are pivotal to land on Minmus. Not exactly required because of the low gravity, but nice to have. You see batteries and solar panels as well. You also see one final separation, so once we are on course to enter the atmosphere, we can separate this whole thing. None of this is coming back with us. Just the capsule with our 3 Kerbals inside, and our last stage is our parachute. So let's take it to the launch pad and plot our course. Where are we going to go? How do we get into orbit? Well, that's a very valid question to ask. If we go to the map view and press M and zoom in on our space center, well, where do we want to go? Well, we want to go to the 90 degree. We want to fly east. Well, why? Essentially, if we left click on this icon here, we get an orbit speed of 175 meters a second. And yes, that means that right now we are going 175 meters a second in an easterly direction, that way, because this is how the planet is rotating. So we get, essentially for free, get 175 meters a second speed for doing nothing, which is good. Now, you might be thinking ahead and thinking, wow, so if you fly west, does that mean you have to cancel this speed? Yes. That is why you never launch west, because you spend precious resources, precious fuel that you might need to cancel out this 175 meters a second before you even start heading west in the first place. If you want to launch a satellite in a polar orbit, meaning the satellite goes around like this, you are fighting this 175 meters a second pull to go north. So instead of just launching straight north and having nothing to worry about, you're actually launching this way. You're drifting to the right, and you're constantly pointing the rocket to the left, telling it, no, I want it to go north. I don't want to be north-northeast. I want to be perfectly north. So you have to cancel this movement. But because we're going in orbit, we want this to help us. Now to get back to our surface speed, we left-click once more. And that means when we launch, we are going to press the space bar to ignite these engines, and we will press space bar again to release the clamps, and off we go. We will hit T, and Maela is a pilot, so she can keep this pointed in the right direction. We want to go, let's say 80% throttle-ish, 75, 80%. And here we go. We're going to hit space bar twice. 1, 2. Off we go. Use your D key and kind of tilt it over. Now that is good. We don't want to get too aggressive. We just want the thrust vector to stay on the 90, and we want to pick up speed. There goes our first stage. Like it said, we run out of fuel very quickly, but now these are not going to run out of fuel as quick. Let's sort of keep the rocket pointing in the thrust vector so we are pushing through the hole in the air that we are punching. And I'm just hitting the spacebar there for every time that we run out of fuel and we need to drop them. Up, we're starting to get gravity effects or aerodynamic effects, so I'm throttling down a bit. We're punching through the thickest part of the atmosphere, so there's no need to waste fuel to just sit there and spin our tires. All right, we're about to deploy those, and we're off. We only have our mainsail engine here pushing us, but notice the fuel. This tank is completely full of fuel, so we can burn this for much longer than if the fuel tanks were independent and this was not connected to anything. So now that we're going up, we can hit the M key, and we can look at our orbit, and we can bring up the nav ball to see how we're doing. We want this apoapsis to be above 70. So that is essentially where we are going. Let's hit the M key and go back to the rocket, make sure we're not flipping out of control or seeing heating effects. You can see the side slip that we're doing. Our thrust vector is pointing more this way, but our rocket is pointed up to keep the thrust vector above the horizon, so we're wasting fuel to keep our altitude going in an upward motion. Now we're starting to show heating effects just a little bit, but that's not bad. We'll be okay. And we're really starting to pick up speed now, so once this hits 75 or 80, I'm going to cut the throttle. It is not the most efficient way. Most efficient would be to, follow the horizon just above 70 and just keep on burning, which is essentially what we're looking like we're doing here. Once we hit 80, I'll hit the X key and kill the engine. The next thing I'm going to do is plan what's called a maneuver node. Essentially, Kerbal Space Program gives you the ability to plot out a course without actually firing, without actually completing it, to see what would happen. We are going to left click here on the AP, the highest point in our orbit, and we are going to install a maneuver node. So left click, add maneuver, and we want to continue going in the speed that we were, in the direction that we were going. And we do that just by pulling this little node. You can click on the node to bring it back. And what we are looking for is the orange dotted line to increase to the point where we see PE, periaps, and we want these two to go to the sides of the planet, just like that. So now, in a perfect world, where we burn for 23 seconds at full throttle, we get into an 80 by 80 orbit, which is what we want. Now, I want to talk about this timer right here. This is important because this calculation is if and only if we are able to burn all 23 seconds in that instant. Well, you can't. You physically cannot do it. So how do you complete this maneuver? Well, we average it out. We cut this number in half, so we make this 11 to 12 seconds, and we burn 11 to 12 seconds before this point, all the way through it to 11 to 12 seconds after, making the average of the burn right there dead center. So it simulates 23 seconds right there at that point. And keep in mind, this is at full throttle because we were at full throttle before we made the maneuver, and it calculated how much engine power we were using last. This number will change if we lose the section of the rocket and go to a different engine, or if you are only at 25% throttle this whole time and put in that maneuver, this number would be different. So just keep that in mind. Now, if we want to get to our maneuver faster, we can left click after the maneuver and warp to the next maneuver. It will automatically get you to within 1 minute. So, waiting for that, waiting, and there we go, time warp complete. And now we want to tell Mauella to go to the maneuver node. Now, only pilots who are experienced have this button, but this will make our lives a whole lot easier because I am not touching a thing. Mauella is pointing the rocket right at that maneuver node. So now all we have to do as a pilot is to wait until 11 or 12 seconds and then hit the Z key to go full throttle. Now, if your rocket is moving a little bit and you're above 70, you can hit that little caret and it will freeze the rocket in place. There we go. Well, we missed our node. So we'll just make do with what we got. We are at full throttle. She's staying on the maneuver, and we want to cut our thrust when this reaches 0. Essentially, you see how much time is left in the burn as it stands. So she'll keep burning, and 2.8 meters a second difference. I'll just Shift and X very quickly, alternate it. There we go, 0.1. Hit the check mark, the maneuver node goes away. I'll turn off SAS, and you saw that camera sort of rotate a little bit. What that tells me is we are now in orbit. And if we look, 82.3 and 78.8. It's not a perfect orbit, but it is an orbit. We will not fall back into the atmosphere. So now, that's the hard part done. Where do we go from here? Well, you might be tempted to go to the moon because it's closer. But the moon is also much, much bigger. If we focus view on the moon, you can see how big the moon is, which means a higher gravity, and there is no atmosphere on the moon to slow us down. So we have to do all of our slowing down on our rocket engine. But if we zoom out and focus our view on Minmus, and we zoom in, much smaller, much lower gravity, and even though there's no atmosphere, we won't use as much fuel to land there. So that is going to be our target. Let me focus my view on my space capsule one more time. Come on now. Come on. Come on. It's a little fidgety at this zoom level. You know what? Perfect. You can hit escape and then go back to the space center. Your ship will still be in orbit, and you can catch it in the tracking station. So that's what we're going to do. We'll left click the tracking station. We'll zoom in here, and we see that our spaceship is getting 4 lines of communication, Kerbal X, and we want to click the fly button. Do not click the terminate button, that will kill it. But here we go, we're back. So let's plot our maneuver to Minmus. The first thing we want to do is set it as our target. So we left click on it, and we set it as a target. These two things pop up. It's called an ascending and descending node. What that means is if we were to look at the orbit from this dotted line where the paths cross, you can see, if I zoom in here, the difference in the orbit. Minmus's orbit actually comes down above our blue line, crosses right here in the center, and then goes below our blue line. This cross is at 3.6 degrees. Now, if this was a perfect world and we were to burn from back here, burn straight along this dotted line and meet Minmus here, we would not have to adjust our inclination because this is the point here and here that the orbits intersect. However, I will show you how to cancel out this number so you can essentially reach anywhere you want to without relying on pure luck. The first thing we want to do is see which one are we coming up to first, the ascending or the descending. Well, we're going east around the planet, so the first one we're going to come to is the ascending node. We will left click on the ascending node right there and we'll add a maneuver, and what we want to do is change our inclination down. Because we are ascending, we want to bring that down. And as we pull down, we'll see our apoaps and periaps change, but also we see the dotted line change. We want the dotted line to do just like the apoaps and periaps and get to the opposite ends of the planet like that. That will make the ascending and descending node perfect zeros. That's going to be 143.8 meters a second. Now, we don't have an estimated burn, unfortunately, so we have to sort of wing this ourselves, which we can do. That is, that's no big deal. I don't think 143 seconds is going to be much, so I'm going to click past the maneuver once more, warp to the next maneuver. The ship is going to automatically time warp in a conservative fashion to T-minus 1 minute, just like that. And now when we go back to the ship and we tell our intrepid pilot Maela to go to the maneuver, and remember, if you don't see these key buttons over here, press the T key and turn on your SAS. Thankfully, she is also turning to where the solar panel is in direct sunlight to help get that battery recharge. you can sort of see our orientation here. She's pointing the nose straight down, which is signified also by this purple triangle pointing down, that we are pointing down and we are shifting our orbit because we're actually moving in this direction. So we're pointing down. We will change our orbit by 143 meters a second. Let's just go now. So I was a little early. So I'll wait until we get closer to the descending node. And matter of fact, I'll go anti-normal here. And then just slowly burn until we reach 0. Just like that. And then see what that did for us. I'll go out to the map. Our periapse is 79. Our apoapse is 86. But our ascending node is 0.1. And that's good enough for government work. Since we are now on the same plane as Minmus, if we were to look here at where the lines cross, it's a 0.1 degree difference now. So essentially, we can launch at any optimal time to meet it. A good rule of thumb is to go 90 degrees or so. So with it being over here, the next time we get to here, we should burn, because any speed change made affects the back of the orbit. So we want to speed up here. That's going to push our orbit out. And then once our orbit gets big enough, well, what you actually saw there, that purple flash, is an encounter with the moon. So even though we're not aiming for the moon, we're going to hit it if we stopped here. And this is a good time for me to talk about gravity assist. So at this point here, for burning for 19 seconds, we come out to here, to 15.5 thousand, 15,500,000 meters. What that will do is, in a normal world, we would just come back down to Kerbal. But because we're encountering the moon here, we're encountering the moon's sphere of influence, we're getting pulled by the moon, we will pass by the moon at 146,000 meters and get flung up nice and high to where our nearest point of Kerbal is 7 million and our furthest point is 24 million. So at the cost of getting up to 15, we can actually get out to 24, doing absolutely nothing. So this is the power of gravity assist. Now let's just continue on and plot our course to Minmus. Let's just not pay attention to the moon for now. We're not doing the moon yet. Once our node gets close, once our apoapse sort of crosses the orbit that Minmus is on, we see these triangles. This means that when we reach our apoapsis here, Minmus will only be here. So we have to adjust our timing. Now, thankfully, since we adjusted our inclination, we don't have to worry about our timing. We can just scoot the timing a little earlier and encounter Minmus right there. Now, if we did not adjust our inclination, we may not catch Minmus here because we would be shooting way under it or way above it. But we line them up first, and now we can launch at the ideal time to meet it. So if we were to burn for 20 solid seconds, we would encounter Minmus in 7 days and 5 hours, and we would leave in 8 days and 3 hours. So essentially we have 1 day where we can burn retrograde at the periapsis. This is our lowest point. So we will be captured by Minmus, and then we will land. But that will be in the next episode, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this made sense as far as getting into orbit, and I hope this maneuver node system makes sense here. We will talk about it once more when we do the next episode, but that is going to do it for me in this episode, ladies and gentlemen. Like, share, and subscribe if you are so bold, and Maella in the next episode will be heading for Minmus. Take care.